Please be seated. So today's readings are pretty hard, don't you think? They're hard readings, and they open the hardness of this season of Lent. They're hard readings about the reality of human sin and our own need for salvation. Now, many have said that Episcopalians sometimes have a hard time talking about sin. We believe, rightly, in the fundamental goodness of humanity. We are all created in the image and likeness of God, who is love, after all. We proclaim this in a world that stubbornly clings to kind of medieval ideas about a wrathful God out to punish people for their sins. But do we sometimes sugarcoat the idea of sin in the process? Well, our Book of Common Prayer has no such difficulty. It tells us in the Catechism that sin is the seeking of our own will instead of the will of God, thus distorting our relationship with God, with other people, and with all of creation. Seems straightforward enough, but we still don't like to talk about sin. We make jokes. We talk about those little temptations that we face, the ones with names like triple chocolate sin fudge cake. Doesn't that sound good? But we try to hide the really big sins on both a personal and societal level. I mean, think about the fact that it has taken more than 200 years for the American church to even start having honest conversations about the sin of racism, for example. But you know what? We can't hide our failings and our faults. We can't hide them from ourselves, and we can't hide them from God either. There's this traditional prayer for the beginning of Lent, and it implores God, "Oh God, come quickly to help us who are assaulted by many temptations, as you, oh God, know the weaknesses that are in each of us." See, it's actually not a secret that all of us struggle with sin. We can't avoid temptation. Even Jesus couldn't do that. That's why we read some sort of form of the reading of the temptations in the wilderness every year at the start of Lent. But you know what? I think we'd also rather get through temptation without succumbing, without sinning. But the truth is that sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. So we may as well talk about sin. And here we go. The readings, well, they help us out because today's readings begin with one of the most infamous episodes in the whole human history on human sin. It's the story of the Great Flood. You see, God is just so fed up with humanity at the point where Noah's Ark begins. He's fed up with their sinfulness, and God just wants complete do-over. God's plan is to wipe out almost every living being with a catastrophic deluge, and then to just sort of start over from scratch. Now, I know that we all know the story of Noah's Ark. It's in every children's Bible. It's in every Sunday school curriculum ever written. And it's huge in popular culture too. So much so that I think it's probably got more silly jokes associated with it than any other story in the Bible. I'm going to invite you to unmute because I just want to test you and see how you do with some of these jokes. So if you want to try to answer, hit your unmute button. All right, here's the first one. Shout it out if you think you know the answer. What kind of lighting did Noah use on the ark? Anyone got an answer?
LED.
LED, that's a good one. What about Nathaniel? Floodlights. Did anyone else get it?
Right.
We got a big, terrible dad joke here.
Yeah.
All right. Number 2. Where did Noah keep his bees? Anyone?
Bees.
Bees.
Bees. Where did he keep his bees?
In the archive.
In the
Yes.
archive.
In the archives. Good one.
Oh, good.
I know they're terrible, aren't they? All right, I got one more for you all. Why weren't there any worms on the ark? This one's tougher. Do you want me to give you the answer?
Yep.
All right. It's because worms come in apples, not pears. Thank you for your participation. So as I have just proven, Noah's Ark, it's everywhere in all sorts of ways. But puns aside, this story is serious stuff. I mean, God is ready to just do away with absolutely everything. But you know what? Then God just takes this tiny little step back from that horrific ledge. Instead, God decides to save Noah's family. And God throws in a breeding pair from every living species in order to kind of jumpstart the repopulation of Earth post-deluge. Now, the traditional language is that Noah found favor in God's sight. That's what it says in the NRSV. We are assured when we're children that this meant that Noah's family were the only ones that didn't make the naughty list. And so often when we were kids, that whole story was used as kind of like the ultimate object lesson for children about what happens when we fail to make the nice list year after year after year. But you know what? It didn't occur to me as a child. But when you think about it, this story, well, it's probably more like 3 parts disturbing and only 1 part reassuring, really. That's why I like this little piece of this huge 5-chapter epic that we're given today. I mean, it's curious, really, because what are we usually told in Sunday school about why the rainbow is in the sky? I don't know about you, but I was told it's there to remind us of God's promise never to destroy everything again, right? But that's not what it says here. Listen to what the reading said. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant, and the water shall never become a flood again that destroys all flesh. Listening to that, it seems more like God is the one that needs the reminding here. You see, this is kind of an incredible turning point in the dynamic between the creator and the creation, because God actually changes course. There's no more tossing out of humanity, out of paradise, or wiping them off the face of the earth. No matter how frustrating, God is going to stick it out with us. God's going to partner with us and save us from ourselves and the consequences of our worst human impulses. Now, I know there's been plenty of conversation and controversy about this whole biblical story throughout Christian history. We have all sorts of interpretations going all the way back to that one in today's reading from 1 Peter, equating the flood with the cleansing waters of baptism. We love to look at similar flood stories across all different cultures and religious traditions. And we even like to argue about whether the story is historical or allegorical. But you know what? It's the story that defines God's relationship with us from this point forward. It's the moment. After the rainbow, God's intent for intimacy and God's capacity for compassion, well, it transcends all of these whims of human behavior. You know, even though God gives us good guidance, we pretty much still ignore it. We have this enduring tendency to run away from God's total offer of love, but that does not change God's promise to stick it out with us. We create a divide between us and God from this point forward does everything in God's power to bridge that gap. As much as we hate to admit it, this is our story. It's our human story. It may sometimes feel arbitrary that it happens that God, not listening to God, can alienate us from God. We also know this truth in our own relationships. I mean, how many of us with our spouses can recall arguments that have sprung us up from one of us not listening to the other? That rainbow in the sky, it's God saying, I will never stop listening to you, even when you're not listening to me. Individuals and whole peoples forget this truth over and over again. We, like every person right on back to Adam and Eve, sometimes follow our own voices without listening to the voices of others too. How much harder is it then for us to listen to the voice of God? The story of Noah's Ark also tells us that we, human beings, have the capacity for both good and evil, good choices and bad choices. It's a great power and a great temptation. Noah's Ark is that cosmic reminder of what we prefer to get, that all of us have sinned. It is no accident that the very next story in the Bible after Noah's Ark is the story of the Tower of Babel. It goes on to illustrate that human inclination to just play God and ignore God, or at least to grasp at the power of God that we imagine as divine, it has tragic consequences for us and it never seems to go away. Think of all the real choices over life and death that we have today. In medicine, we've developed the need to ask when life starts and when it can end. We can now create life with dignity, and we have to choose how to end it with dignity. We develop those powers even when we can't always satisfactorily answer these questions. Think of all the people throughout human history who have set out to conquer the world, only to ultimately fail, killing and oppressing millions in the process. The ancient Egyptians, the ancient Persians, the ancient Assyrians, and the Babylonians, the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Arab tribes, the European colonial powers, the Nazis, the fascists, the communists. I mean, history is just littered with that human story. In global politics, we still have the same games taking place today. I mean, how many of us remember growing up when we were young and all of those years when we lived under the fear that the world could be destroyed by a nuclear war? Today, we have all kinds of vast medical knowledge and power. We could use it to combat this terrible pandemic. But you know what we've struggled with this year? We've struggled with how to find common purpose and political will to make the good choices about how to protect everyone from the virus's ravages, how to distribute all of those miracle vaccines quickly and with equity. Yet, sin is the seeking of our own will instead of the will of God, thus distorting our relationship with God, with other people, and with the whole of creation. Pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? It's our story. Humans try to play God, and you know what? It costs us every time. But we have another story today, too. The author of First Peter reminds us that Jesus' story is the human story, too. But it has a different ending. This author tells us that Jesus suffers alongside us in all of this crazy mess in order to bring us closer to God and to what God intended for us. In Mark's gospel, the story of the temptation in the wilderness, well, it's tightly wrapped up. It's wrapped up on either side by Jesus's baptism on one end and the start of Jesus's ministry on the other. Jesus is God, it says. Jesus is tempted like us so that he can walk hand in hand with us to lead us into the way of God's kingdom. There was bad news for humanity at the start of Noah's story. After the rainbow, God figured out another way forward. This incredible good news in Jesus is that new story. It is clear from today's readings that sin and temptation are real for us. The one central truth in Noah's story is that death is a consequence for humanity, but so is life. In these few short lines from the beginning of Mark's gospel, Jesus shows himself to be just what the author of First Peter declares him to be, the bridge that's there between our human failings and our original blessing in God. We can and we do sin. We choose our own selfish ways instead of God's ways. of abundant life for all. We hurt ourselves, we hurt others, and we hurt our world. We also hurt God. But you know what? We make right choices too. And God's grace is there for us in all of this very human struggle, just as the Spirit was with Jesus in the wilderness. You see, I actually wonder if part of the reason for Lent is to help keep us from the temptation to avoid talking about sin. We have it scheduled, we do it every year, and I think we kind of need this. I read this story recently about a televangelist who was skipping Lent in his congregation this year because you know what? He said, it's such a downer. You know what? Maybe we too are tempted to skip the humbling reminder of the reason for our need for salvation. I mean, who could blame us than with all that we've been through in the last 12 months? I mean, right? But the reality is that Easter makes no sense without Lent. Risen to new life. I mean, why bother if the old life, well, we were doing it all just perfectly on our own? If we were just fine, we wouldn't need God, much less an incarnational God come to live and die with us to show us into this new life. And you know what? To help keep it all in perspective, Lent does not begin with the stories of sin and temptation. Lent begins on Ash Wednesday with penitence and absolution, forgiveness, complete forgiveness for all our sins. We're forgiven before we even get to the Sunday full of sin talk. After the rainbow, we can ask God for forgiveness, and God gives it to us every time, no matter what. We as humans, well, we still so often get it wrong. We sin, and we have from long before the rainbow. But God always finds our inner truth as carriers of that breath of God that God placed there from the very beginning. God never loses track of that relationship with us, even if sometimes we do. That is God's promise to us, and it's written in the skies, and it's written on our hearts. Amen.